The chain was already wet. On one side of the lane sat a brand new Case IH Quad-Track 715. $700,000 of tracked horsepower, sponsor vinyl on the hood, cameras mounted to the cab, software updated the night before. On the other side sat a widow in a faded straw hat on a steam tractor built in 1913. The crowd laughed, not because they were cruel, because they thought they understood what they were looking at. A smart machine, a relic, rubber tracks, old iron lugs, satellite guidance, boiler pressure, a young operator with a crew and a trailer full of tools, and a 71-year-old woman who had come alone. But stay with me, because what happened in that Arkansas field did more than embarrass an expensive machine. It exposed the difference between power and understanding. The Delta Iron and Harvest Days ground sat just outside DeWitt, where the blacktop gives up and the world turns flat, wet, and serious. 3 days of rain had rolled through the rice country before the weekend show. Not enough to flood the grounds, but enough to leave the pole lane wearing a slick skin of gray-brown gumbo that shined under the noon light like something alive. By 10 that morning, the fences were full. People leaned over the rails with paper cups of lemonade. Kids climbed hay bales for a better look. Men in seed caps argued about torque and ballast, and whether a tracked machine had any business entering an exhibition pole on a lane that soft. Women shaded their eyes and looked toward the far end where the newest equipment was parked in a polished row like a dealership had spilled into the fairgrounds. And then there was the other machine. Lila Crow's steam tractor sat by itself near the south fence, dark green under soot and old varnish, brass whistle dulled by decades of weather, steel wheels fitted with deep spade lugs that looked less like farm equipment and more like something built to walk out of a war. A hand-painted name curved along the boiler jacket in chipped cream letters: Magnolia. Lila had arrived before sunrise. No banners, no crew shirts, no drone footage, no folding tent with her name printed on the valance. Just a dented one-ton truck, a lowboy trailer, a wooden toolbox, and Magnolia breathing little white threads of steam into the cool morning air. She backed the trailer into place herself. She dropped the ramps herself. She brought the old machine down slow enough that each iron lug touched the ground like it was meeting an old friend again after a long winter. Then she checked everything in the same order she always had: water glass, firebox draft, injector line, drive chain tension, cylinder cocks, boiler pressure. After that, she poured coffee from a metal thermos into a lid cup, sat on the drawbar, and watched the morning lift off the rice stubble beyond the fence. People noticed her, but not the way they notice a threat. Notice an old church bell or a mule team in a parade. Something worth looking at, something with history, something that belongs to another way of doing things. Mason Pike arrived at 11 with enough noise to rearrange the air. His truck was black, spotless, and wrapped with the logo of Pike Precision Ag in silver and red. Behind it sat the quad-track on a polished, detachable trailer, the track still carrying the faint factory ribs on the outer edges. 2 men climbed out behind him, one with a tablet case, one with a camera rig on a stabilizer. Mason himself came down from the cab wearing mirrored sunglasses, a branded fishing shirt, and the confident walk of a man who had spent a long time being told he was the future. He was 32, rich twice over, once from his family's land money and once from the online persona he had built around efficient agriculture, modern systems, and never leaving yield to chance. He knew machinery, He knew markets. He knew how to make 300,000 people online believe that every acre could be solved if you brought enough data to it. He also knew he was being watched. When he saw Magnolia, he stopped, grinned, and said exactly the kind of thing men say when they are certain the day belongs to them. "Tell me that's for the parade," he said. The taller assistant laughed first. A few people near the trailer laughed with him. Mason kept looking at the steam tractor. "Because if that's my competition, somebody owes me fuel money." That got a bigger laugh. Lila didn't answer. She was tightening the leather glove on her right hand. She glanced over once, not offended, not flustered, just measuring. Then she went back to checking the drawbar pin. That should have unsettled him more than it did. On paper, there was no contest. The quad track carried 778 peak horsepower, automatic slip control, hydraulic ballast management, adjustable track tension, and a control stack that processed traction changes faster than any human nervous system. It was a machine built by people with laboratories, wind tunnels, data centers, and 100 years of manufacturing money behind them. Magnolia was a 1913 Nichols and Shepard steam tractor that on a strong fire and a patient hand might give you 50 honest horsepower and a little more if you knew exactly where the iron could be asked to suffer. There was no monitor, no telemetry, no GPS, no software. The seat was steel. The gauges were round. The controls were levers and valves and muscle memory. But numbers do not always measure the right thing. The rules were simple. Hank Sutter, who had run the exhibition ring at Delta Iron and Harvest Days for 19 years, stepped into the lane with a red flag and a microphone that crackled every third word. 70 feet of chain between the two machines. Best 2 out of 3. Win the round by dragging the other machine 8 feet past the white marker at center. Distance once the flag drops. Any visible mechanical failure ends the round immediately. He read it all in the bored, practiced cadence of a man who had explained rules to overeager men his entire life. But beneath the boredom was something else, concern, because everybody there could see what he could see. The lane was wrong for spectacle. The top 2 inches were slick as lard from the rain and the noon heat. If that old boiler got pushed too hard and a seam let go in front of a crowd, people would remember it for the rest of their lives, not as a lesson, as a humiliation. Lila climbed onto Magnolia and settled into the seat with the stillness of somebody sitting down at a piano she had owned longer than some people had been alive. She placed one hand on the steam regulator, one on the reverse lever, and looked not at Mason, but at the lane. That is important. Mason looked at Lila's tractor. Lila looked at the ground. Round 1 started ugly. Hank dropped the flag and Mason hit the quad track hard enough to make the crowd flinch. The diesel rose with that heavy, expensive sound modern high horsepower tractors make when all the noise deadening in the world cannot hide the fact that something enormous has just been asked to shove the earth backward. The chain snapped tight. Magnolia lurched. The steel lugs dragged through the slime on top, and the old tractor slid backward almost 3 feet before the crowd had finished shouting. Mud sprayed from beneath the tracks of the quad track. The cameraman near Mason's trailer whooped so loud his voice cracked. Somebody near the rail yelled, "That's more like it!" This is where most people thought the old machine would panic itself to death. Wide open steam, too much pressure, wheel spin, a showy failure. Lila did none of that. She opened the regulator exactly 2 finger widths, no more. The boiler answered with a low, chest-deep chuff. The connecting rods found rhythm. The rear wheels stopped skating and began to bite in pulses, not frantic, not theatrical, just steady enough to start looking for something under the grease. The backward motion slowed, then stopped. The chain between the tractors sang under tension, a humming metallic note like a fence wire in a hard wind. Mason drove harder. The quad track answered with more noise, more power, more black smoke laid low over the lane. Magnolia did not move forward, but it did not move back either. For 12 long seconds the whole field held still except for steam and diesel and the tiny vibration running through the chain. Then Hank stepped in, checked the marker, and spread both arms. Dead pull. No round. The crowd went quiet in that disbelieving way a crowd does when it realizes it has misread a situation and has not yet decided how to repair its dignity. Mason looked out through the cab glass with his jaw set so hard it changed the shape of his face. One of his assistants was already tapping across a tablet. First time, the day became interesting. And right here, before we go any farther, if you're the kind of person who loves stories where old knowledge refuses to die quietly, this is your kind of channel. Because what happened next was the part that separated machinery from mastery. Round 2 began with less ego and more engineering. Mason adjusted track tension, redistributed ballast, and switched to a more controlled launch map that fed power in with precision instead of shock. It was impressive. You could watch the machine thinking, sensors reading slippage, torque moving where grip seemed strongest, each system doing exactly what millions of dollars had paid it to do. This time the quad track did not leap, it loaded. The chain rose, tightened, held. Then, slowly, Magnolia began to go backward. 1 foot, then another. Lila worked the regulator harder. The fire answered. Pressure climbed. Steam rolled off the cylinder area in white puffs that smelled faintly of oil and hot water. The rear wheels clawed deeper, but the lane near center had been polished by the first round. The slick top was breaking under her lugs too fast, smearing into something greasy enough to betray steel before it could find a hold. The marker crossed to Lila's side. 3 feet, then 5. Hank lifted the red flag. Round 2 to Mason Pike. The crowd on his side erupted. A line of young men by the rail slapped hats against their thighs and shouted themselves hoarse. One voice rose above the rest. "Somebody park that kettle!" More laughter. Mason climbed down smiling now. Not wild, not arrogant like before, but with the composure of a man who believed the world had corrected itself. He said something to the assistant with the tablet. The assistant nodded. The camera turned toward Magnolia again, ready to film the old machine's respectable ending. Lila climbed down from the seat. She did not look at Mason. She did not look at the crowd. She crouched in the lane and pressed 3 fingers into the mud. Then she rubbed the clay between thumb and forefinger like she was testing flour. That detail was lost on most people. Not all. An old man in a co-op cap near the fence leaned forward so sharply his grandson had to grab his sleeve to keep him from tipping over the rail. He saw what she was doing, and when he saw it, his expression changed. Lila stood, walked 6 paces left of the chain line, and pressed the heel of her boot into the ground. Then 4 paces right. Then back to Magnolia. She opened the wooden toolbox mounted near the rear deck and took out a short, square-ended spanner, black with use, the corners rounded smooth by hands that had known it for decades. She knelt at the final drive housing and made one quiet adjustment nobody under 40 recognized. Not because it was complicated, because it belonged to a vocabulary the world had mostly stopped speaking. She set the locking dog in the rear drive equalizer, mechanically, physically, with iron meeting iron. What that meant was simple. No rear wheel on Magnolia would be allowed to spin away power on its own. If one found bite, both pulled. If one sank, both bore it. No waiting for slip to begin. No sensor to detect loss and answer it a fraction later. No computer deciding how much correction was appropriate. Just a hard decision made in steel before the round ever started. Then she climbed up again. The old man in the co-op cap exhaled through his teeth and said to nobody in particular, "Lord, she found the hard shelf." A few people turned toward him. Most did not hear, but the day had changed. By the time round 3 was called, the air had gone still and heavy, that kind of delta stillness, the kind that makes your shirt cling between the shoulder blades and turns every smell sharper than it ought to be. Coal smoke, diesel, mud, hot hydraulic oil, fried catfish from the vendor trailer, wet clay slowly baking a skin in the afternoon sun. Kids had stopped wandering. Nobody cared about the craft booths anymore. Nobody cared about the antique threshers running at the far end of the grounds. Every set of eyes along the rail was fixed on one muddy lane and 2 machines, separated by 70 feet of chain and a century of philosophy. Hank took his place at the marker. Mason settled into the quad-track cab with the still, narrowed look of a man who had decided he would not be surprised twice. His hands moved across the controls. Mode check, slip target, engine map, steering lockout. He was good. That mattered too. Arrogance had gotten him to the lane, but competence had gotten him to the 3rd round. Lila sat higher than him and somehow seemed smaller inside her machine, not diminished, just enclosed by it, as though Magnolia had accepted her into its own posture. She checked the water level once more, opened the draft, nudged the fire, let pressure climb to the point she trusted and not an inch beyond. There was no secret reserve valve, no miracle, no movie magic. There was only a correct understanding of what the lane was offering and a willingness to ask the machine for everything the truth of that lane could justify. That is a much rarer thing. Hank's flag rose. The crowd vanished into silence. Then it dropped. Mason launched clean. The quad track loaded deep and true, tracks pressing flat, engine note hard and full, power reaching the lane in a way that would have dominated almost any exhibition ground in the state. Mud fanned behind the track lugs in long, dark sheets. The chain straightened with a crack. Magnolia jerked. For half a second it slid backward. A cheer started on Mason's side of the rail, then died unfinished, because Magnolia did not keep sliding. The equalizer held both rear wheels together, and the steel spade lugs punched through the false skin of the lane into the tacky layer underneath, the layer the sun had not reached, the layer with enough body left in it to answer force instead of surrendering to it. Lila felt it through the seat before anybody else saw it. She fed steam, not all at once, not recklessly, in measured pulses that matched the ground's willingness to carry her. The rear wheels turned one deliberate quarter rotation. The chain quivered. Mason pushed harder. The quad track responded like the masterpiece it was, but now was fighting the wrong battle. The wide tracks were spreading power beautifully across a surface layer that was no longer telling the truth. They were skating the slick skin while Magnolia's lugs were digging below the lie. The center marker trembled, then moved. 1 inch toward Mason, then 2, then 6. The old co-op farmer took off his cap and slapped it against his leg. People started shouting, but not in words. The sound was too raw for that at first, just noise from human throats when a thing they thought impossible begins, in plain sight, to become real. Mason saw it. You could watch the moment travel through him. He fed more throttle. The tracks bit, then smeared. The traction system corrected, bit again, smeared again. A computer can react faster than a man. It cannot change what layer of ground a machine is actually living on. Magnolia advanced another foot. Steam hammered out of the exhaust in deep timed breaths. Each chuff sounded less like struggle than agreement, as though the tractor and the ground had decided something together without consulting the rest of the afternoon. 3 feet past center. Hank bent, eyes level with the white marker, tracking the chain with total disbelief. 5 feet. The crowd was screaming now. Mason's assistant with the camera had stopped filming. He was just staring. The tablet operator looked from the screen to the lane and back again, as if one of them must be lying. 7 feet. Mason held nothing back. The quad track dug hard enough to tear shallow ridges in the slick top layer, but the more it churned that grease, the less the tracks could do with it. Expensive precision was being asked to solve the wrong problem in real time. 8 feet. Hank threw the red flag so high it tumbled once in the air before he caught it on the way down. Round 3. Lila Crow. For 2 seconds, the entire grounds fell silent. Then the place came apart. Not just cheering, release. The kind of sound people make when they have watched certainty crack open in public and discovered to their delight that doubt is much more entertaining. Children ducked under the rail. Men climbed the fence they had been leaning on. Someone near the food trailers blew an air horn twice. A woman in rubber boots started laughing so hard she had to hold on to her friend's shoulder to stay upright. Lila did not stand. She eased the regulator back, managed the fire down, watched the boiler like it still mattered more than the applause. That, more than the win, was what changed the mood around her. She was not basking, she was tending. The machine had given her everything it had, and now she was responsible for bringing it home safe. By the time she finally set the brake and removed her glove, Magnolia was ringed 3 people deep. A boy no older than 10 stood staring at the rear wheel, his face slack with that sacred kind of awe children sometimes feel before they learn to hide it. A mechanic from Stuttgart crouched beside the final drive and peered at the locking dog arrangement with reverence. An elderly woman in a church visor reached up and touched the boiler jacket with 3 fingertips, as if confirming that it was, in fact, a real thing, and not some story the heat had invented. Mason did not join them at first. He stayed in the cab, hands on the wheel, looking straight ahead. His assistants had already begun the quiet ritual of losing. Camera case zipped, tablet shut down, toe shackles gathered. Nobody spoke louder than necessary. Eventually Mason climbed down. He walked across the lane alone. The mud took his clean boots and changed them immediately, which felt right. He stopped beside Magnolia's right rear wheel and looked up at Lila. Without the sunglasses, he seemed younger and less certain, as if losing had peeled a layer off him that all the equipment in the world had been helping him carry. He asked one question: how? Lila looked at him for a moment, then climbed down slowly, favoring one knee the way people do when the weather has worked on them for years. She bent, picked up a clod the chain had turned over near the marker, and broke it open in both hands. Inside it was different. Dry gray smear on the outside, darker, tackier clay underneath. She held it out so he could see the layers. Top skin lies, she said. Mason said nothing. She pressed a thumb into the darker center and the clay held the mark. Your track stayed up here. She touched the dry, slick outer shell. This old girl dropped below it. Then she looked at the lane, not at him. Folks think the ground is one thing because it looks like one thing from above. It isn't. That would have been enough, but after a second, she added the line that people would repeat for years in coffee shops and machine sheds all over Arkansas. Horsepower pushes, she said. Understanding finds where to stand. Mason stared at the clod in her hand as if it offended him to realize a field could contain an argument his screens had never shown him. He did not try to defend the quad track. He did not say the lane was unfair. He did not point to money, sponsorship, bad luck, bad calibration, or anything else men usually reach for when pride needs furniture. Instead, he nodded once. A real nod, the kind that costs something. Lila handed him the broken clod. He took it. And for a moment, the richest thing on that field was not the tractor behind him. It was the fact that he was still willing to learn in public. The trophy presentation happened at 4 on the plywood stage by the equipment barn. Somebody found a folding chair for Lila. Hank cleaned the mud off the little brass plate with his handkerchief before giving it to her. Mason stood in the crowd with everybody else and applauded. No one asked him to, he just did. But the trophy wasn't the part people carried home. What they carried home was the image. A sponsored tracked tractor with enough horsepower to pull down a wall. A widow on a steam engine old enough to remember another world. And a muddy lane in Arkansas teaching everybody there that technology is only dominant until it meets a person who understands the problem more deeply than the machine understands the data. That is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is sentimental. This was practical. Lila Crow did not beat a modern tractor because the past was better. She beat it because wisdom is not obsolete just because it is old, because some knowledge lives below the dashboard, because the land keeps secrets from anyone who only reads the surface, and because a machine, no matter how advanced, is still only as good as the questions its operator knows to ask. By sunset, the grounds had mostly emptied. Paper cups rolled along the fence line. The catfish trailer had cut its fryer. Kids were dragging tired feet through the gravel toward pickup trucks. Magnolia sat on the trailer again, chained down, boiler cooling with soft ticks of contracting metal. The quad track was already gone. Lila tightened the last binder, closed the toolbox, and took one final look at the lane. Not proud, not sentimental, just attentive, as if the ground had said something worth remembering and she was making sure she heard it clearly before she left. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment telling me the oldest machine you've ever seen still beats something newer. And if you like these forgotten contests between money and memory, subscribe, because some of the best stories are not about what was strongest. They're about who still knew where to put the force.